The most exciting position in the modern NFL has to be the wide receiver, and that naturally leads us to look at who are the best wide receivers from each team. So let's begin with the AFC, but more specifically, the AFC East division. Now, there is no secret who the best wide receiver is for the Buffalo Bills, and that is Stefon Diggs. Diggs has so far this season the most targets at 144 and receptions with 101. Diggs has also crossed the 1,000-yard threshold with 1,325 yards and scored 10 touchdowns. Whereas in Miami, the Dolphins have a couple of outstanding wide receivers, but the best is the one with the more impressive stats, and that goes to Tyreek Hill. Hill has seen more targets with 165 and thus more receptions with 117. And he has the best catch completion percentage amongst wide receivers with 70.9%. Finding a number one wide receiver in New England is simple enough, as Jakobi Meyers has the most targets with 89 and receptions with 64. He only has 771 receiving yards on the year, but he boasts a high catch percentage of 71.9%. Meyers also leads the team in receiving touchdowns with 5. Not the most glamorous of wide receivers, but still highly effective. And the final team of the AFC East is the New York Jets. Notably, Garrett Wilson leads the team in targets with 130. Wilson also has the most receptions with 74 and has crossed the 1,000-yard mark. He also leads all Jets receivers with 4 touchdowns. Those 4 wide receivers are highly impressive, so could the AFC North match their talent? Well, let's kick things off with the Cincinnati Bengals, who, like the Miami Dolphins, possess 2 extremely talented wide receivers. But the stats don't lie, which is why T. Higgins is the best wide receiver on this team if we go by catch completion percentage. He leads all wide receivers with 71.6%, and he leads all wide receivers in receiving yards with 1,022. Now, he might fall second to Jamar Chase in targets, receptions, and touchdowns, but Higgins is the more efficient wide receiver. Now, efficiency, it's not an issue for the Baltimore Ravens wide receivers, but productivity is. The leading catch percentage wide receiver here is Devin Duvernay with 75.5% from only 49 targets. So it's difficult to pick the best wide receiver here, but if we had to choose between Robinson and Duvernay, we would go with the latter because he has more touchdowns than Demarcus Robinson. However, in Pittsburgh, there is a clear number one. The Steelers have made Deontay Johnson their go-to guy. He has the most receptions with 84 and the most receiving yards with 844. Surprisingly, he has yet to find the end zone this season. But that's certainly not the case for the Cleveland Browns' best wide receiver, Amari Cooper, who has scored 9 touchdowns this season, the most of any wide receiver in the division. Cooper leads the team in targets with 129 and receptions with 76, and has crossed the 1,000-yard mark by earning 1,109 receiving yards. Could the AFC South do better than the North? The Jacksonville Jaguars is another team with 2 potentially great wide receivers. But if we had to pick their number one guy, it's the man who makes the most money from that position, Christian Kirk. Kirk leads the team in targets with 125, receiving yards with 1,009, and touchdowns with 7. But quite the opposite feeling with the Tennessee Titans, who do not have a main man since A.J. Brown left. But their most targeted wide receiver was Robert Woods, who saw 86 targets, had 487 yards, and scored 2 touchdowns. So it's fair to say that the Titans leaned a bit too much on their running game. Thankfully, the same cannot be said about the Indianapolis Colts, who have a clear number one wide receiver, and that's Michael Pittman. Pittman leads the team in targets with 136, receptions with 96, and in the catch completion percentage category with 70.6%. He is lacking in touchdowns with only 3, but that number is sure to rise once the Colts sort out their quarterback situation. Finally, we have the Houston Texans, whose clear number one guy is Brandon Cooks. Cooks leads the team in targets with 87, receptions with 52, and in receiving yards with 593. Now, will the AFC West elevate this conference? The Kansas City Chiefs have been spreading the wealth, but the majority has gone to wide receiver Juju Smith-Schuster. He leads wide receivers in the targets category with 99, receptions with 76, and yards with 898. He also has the best catch completion percentage amongst wide receivers with 76.8%. When it concerns the Las Vegas Raiders, their best wide receiver is Davante Adams. His stats this year are enormous. He leads the team with 171 targets and 95 receptions. He has earned 1,443 receiving yards and has scored 14 touchdowns. He might just be the best wide receiver in the AFC. Now, when we look at the Los Angeles Chargers, we see a talented wide receiver whose main man in the targets category has been Josh Palmer with 101. He has stayed healthy and benefited from the absences of Keenan Allen and Mike Williams, both of whom should be fighting to be the top receiver next season. And finally, it's the disastrous Denver Broncos, whose best wide receiver this year was Jerry Jeudy. Jeudy finished second in targets with 94, first in receptions with 62, first in receiving yards, and first in touchdowns with 6. And that does it for the AFC. Now to the NFC, starting with the East Division and the Philadelphia Eagles, who traded for this man, and he delivered, A.J. Brown. Brown leads the team in targets with 135, receiving yards with 1,401, and touchdowns with 11. Up next, it is the Dallas Cowboys, and their best wide receiver, CeeDee Lamb. Lamb leads the team in targets with 149, receptions with 102, receiving yards with 1,307, and touchdowns with 8. Then we're off to the New York Giants, who have struggled to find a go-to guy in the wide receiver room, but Richie James is emerging as a prime candidate. The young wide receiver is second in targets amongst wide receivers with 70, first in receptions with 57, first in catch completion percentage with 81.4%, and is tied for most receiving touchdowns with 4. On to the Washington Commanders, who are fortunate to have Terry McLaurin as their wide receiver. He leads the team with 114 targets, 74 receptions, and 1,117 yards. Could the NFC North do any better? The Minnesota Vikings have probably the MVP hopeful in the wide receiver position, who goes by the name of Justin Jefferson. Now, Jefferson has a whopping 179 targets, 124 receptions, 1,771 yards, and 8 touchdowns. He might just be the best wide receiver in the league. The Green Bay Packers fall into that category of not knowing who their number one guy is, but based on stats, Allen Lazard is their best wide receiver this season. He led the team in targets with 94, in receptions with 56, and in receiving yards with 747. Now for the Detroit Lions, Amon-Ra St. Brown is a household name for his stellar performances. He led the team in targets with 137, in receptions with 100, in receiving yards with 1,112, and in touchdowns with 6. As for the Chicago Bears, they are still trying to find that number one wide receiver, but this season the main man has been Darnell Mooney, who leads all wide receivers in targets with 61, receptions with 40, and receiving yards with 493. Can the NFC South match that? Well, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers are blessed with talented wide receivers, but the main one is Mike Evans, who leads the team in receiving yards with 1,124 and touchdowns with 6. As for the New Orleans Saints, it is tough to single out one standout wide receiver, but if we had to, that award would go to Chris Olave. The rookie saw the most targets by a wide receiver with 107, and he has the most receiving yards with 982 and the most receptions with 67. The Atlanta Falcons would only want to run the ball if they could, which makes this selection tough for their ears, but their best wide receiver had 109 targets for a catch completion percentage of 60.6%, 746 receiving yards, and 4 touchdowns, all from rookie wide receiver Drake London. The Carolina Panthers traded away pieces except for DJ Moore, who they want to build their franchise around, and have kept feeding their star wide receiver. Moore has 114 targets, and he also has scored the most touchdowns with 7. He has the most receiving yards with 878 and the most receptions with 62. Finally, it's the NFC West and the San Francisco 49ers, whose best wide receiver is Brandon Ayuk, who has stayed healthy and leads the wide receivers in all categories. He has 109 targets, 74 receptions, 956 receiving yards, and 8 touchdowns. As for the Seattle Seahawks, their main man is DK Metcalf. With over 133 targets, 87 receptions, and 1,008 yards, Metcalf has been dominating at the position for the Seahawks. As for the LA Rams, their main wide receiver is, of course, Cooper Kupp. Kupp leads the wide receivers in targets with 98, receptions with 75, yards with 812, and touchdowns with 6. Finally, we have the Arizona Cardinals. Now, statistically speaking, their best wide receiver is DeAndre Hopkins. Despite missing a chunk of games, Hopkins has more receiving yards and just as many touchdowns as his teammate Marquise Hollywood Brown. But Hopkins has the better catch completion percentage of 66.7%, which makes him the better wide receiver. So what do you think of this list? Who would you put in? Please let us know in the comments section below, but before you go, if you still want to watch awesome NFL content like this, please watch the next video that will pop on your screen.